Welcome to our collaborative research project. My name is Christopher Broucek, and I'll be presenting on behalf of Anna Bentoncourt, Tamaida Kali, Kimberly Cruz, Awang Tazafor, and Anna Watkins. This study is, as you can see, examining the relationship between teenagers, vaping, and future studies. Though tobacco use has been a prevalent public health concern within the youth population throughout the years, e-cigarettes or vaping has become an ever-increasing health concern, not only from the increased nicotine ingestion, but also vaping cannabis. The public health problem is how the surge in vaping is now related to lung disease. The current situation since August 2019, there's been 1,300 cases with 33 lay deaths related to vaping. The population most currently vulnerable to vaping is middle school students from 2011 to 2012. The use of e-cigarettes of aerosolized nicotine increased from 3.3 to 6.8%, with the largest gains in Europe and Asia. This results of an estimated total 1.78 million middle school students using this method of nicotine consumption. Science has well-documented studies of the negative health effects of cigarettes, smokeless tobacco, and some on e-cigarettes. There are a lack of current studies addressing the recent health epidemic tied directly to vaping, the variety of chemicals present in e-cigarette aerosols. This is the proposal of an observational study to compile data directly related to the chemicals of e-cigarettes and pulmonary disease. Once the data is assembled, it can be classified into cross-sectional studies for further analysis. This slide represents some common facts among e-cigarette smokers. E-cigarettes via an aerosol delivery system dispense nicotine flavors and other chemicals to the user. Cigarette smoking is the top cause of preventable mortality and morbidity in the USA. Over 16 million people in the US suffer from a disease caused by tobacco products. Not only do users suffer harm, but also the US and the healthcare resources needed to prevent and treat these patients as a high healthcare burden of such diseases at amounts of $170 billion per year. In 2018, 20.8% of high school students reported smoking e-cigarettes. This represents an increase of 1.5 million high school youth since 2017. As future health practitioners, we rely on research to tell us the next forefront of public health. With our own research project that we have going here surrounding vaping, the question goes, is there a relationship in the rise of teenage e-cigarette and vaping and lung disease? What we're aiming for is to establish a relationship between the two so that future studies can go on and place interventions among these populations. The implications of this research and study are that there is a direct relation between the chemicals in addition to the dangers of nicotine and e-cigarette aerosols and the nationwide outbreak currently being witnessed with vaping. Discovering the type of source of the at-risk aerosols is important to limiting or ending this problem. With every research question comes a hypothesis. Our hypothesis that we are trying to prove that there's a relationship is there is a relationship between e-cigarette vaping and lung disease. The alternative hypothesis, or the null hypothesis, would say there is not a relationship between e-cigarettes, vaping, and lung disease. The hypothesis to our research question is that there's a correlational relationship between e-cigarettes and vaping, though it may seem obvious that this type of project will assumably turn into that there is a relationship. The alternative hypothesis may not be most plausible. It can happen without proper research methods taken. Along with our research comes extensive literature review. The two bodies of articles that I liked the most out of the articles that we have researched through are the Chen Sankey article, and this proves how flavored tobacco products is now targeting younger individuals and buying these products. So kind of look at it as if it was a Happy Meal. So the cooler the toy, the more likely the kid would buy the Happy Meal. Same thing goes with cigarettes and how that affects buyers. The second article is that I always like to introduce a pathophysiological article or research topic when it comes to public health because they are so closely related. Bonus and Van Westphal is just a little bit of pathophysiology I'd like to touch on to increase awareness of how physically vaping affects the human body. And so I basically don't lose touch with my molecular biology roots because I still love hard sciences. Essentially, this research explains the phenomena that happens when vaping chemicals come into contact with the human body. It causes cell damage to the bronchus epithelial cell and lung tissue by triggering pathways that lead to cell death. Through cell death or apoptosis is not always bad. Constant triggering of these pathways can mutate cells where survival of these chemical interactions and in turn potentially cause tissue growth to become malignant and cause cancer. Along with all research, there is gaps to be filled, which is why more research continually happens, so we can fill those research gaps or data gaps, specifically in public health, so we can create more awareness for the topics we are passionate about. With e-cigarette and vaping, we felt it was important to include in our study to close literature gaps with a longitudinal study, which means a study that happens over time via observational methods. Since vaping has become a crisis and so prominent now, especially with all the CDC publications coming out, we thought this would be a good opportunity to start the study now so you have long-term gains over time with it to have the most data possible for future researchers to piggyback off of our research. Continuing on, describing a longitudinal study, or our suggested study, which is also observational. Longitudinal studies allows us to look at the same group over time with change at the individual level. This allows researchers to gather data, then can later classify them in subset cross-sectional study. The new questions that should be brought with this study in which the subgroups of teens are most vulnerable in chronic vaping. For example, we are looking over the overall teens that are affected within middle schools from the ages of 13 to 19. With cross-sectional studies, it would introduce other groups allowed to be, kind of under the microscope. So example, yes, we're looking at teenagers, but the cross-sectional study, we would look at, gender, minority, socioeconomic status, and other social determinants of health that would help us categorize people who might not be considered reachable, or in this case, in research, we call them the unreachable groups that may be affected or have a skewedness towards them as well. On to our next slide, which is population, target population, which I already went over, that is from ages 13 to 19 who use e-cigarettes. And then when looking at surveys and how to kind of either have attrition or fallout from not using the right smoking technique in this case, or we'd also use, when it comes to attrition, recruitment, all that great stuff. And then the methods of quantitative data collection, the most effective approach we use is survey, because surveys are mostly either can be physical or online and have a lot of savings to it, and also is easy to reach a large number of population. Since this is a quantitative study, it'd be easier for larger amounts of participants. So the most cost-effective approach, again, is that survey, but then how to keep retention going. For example, one of the best examples I had, if you answered a survey at the end of the SAT or ACT, you would get a free Chipotle from Burrito. It was known as Free Burrito from Chipotle Day. It wasn't that clever. So when looking at how to keep looking at attrition rates, recruitment, and attainment rates, it's really important that there is some sort of incentive for the participant to gain out of it. And if I knew burritos would be such a incentive for me as a young child, I wonder what it would if money was. This slide, we'll delve more into the sampling and recruitment strategy. The sampling element that we use participating high schools from major metropolitan areas nationwide. The sampling frame, participating school district provide lists of high school students. The probability technique was stratified sampling. So the first strata or layer would be the major metropolitan area residents of school attendance, high school students from 13 to 19, and students who had yes to using tobacco products on a regular basis. So on the last page, if you looked at the survey, it said what kind of products you use. We would then weed out participants if they smoked anything else besides vaping products. So we kind of get really narrowed in on that. Another one could be we wouldn't have attrition due to if someone was using both. This next slide goes over bias reduction. Bias is a way of favoring a certain outcome that can invalidate the study. The levels of bias that we are looking at to reduce our bias studies reduce participation bias by giving only the incentives that consumer with what the time and effort required to complete the survey. Giving out the surveys to all participants at the same time will help eliminate social desirability bias, as teens will not be given opportunity to influence each other's answers. Use of random sampling will reduce sampling bias to ensure total teenage population is appropriately presented. Enroll a sufficient amount of students of all ethnic backgrounds and gender that match the criteria for the study to assure unbiased responses. Develop protocol that maintain retention and reduce attrition. For example, with school's approval, make this school requirement to participate. And then lastly is to provide incentives to those participate and complete through the final assessment. Food vouchers, movie tickets, etc., like it said with the burrito day. Since we're now done with our quantitative research, this goes on to our qualitative research. The question is to ask is, what are the factors directly related to vaping and pulmonary lung disease? So with this section, it's going over the interview process of how and what really motivates and drives people. So this process would happen after we have done our data research and then selected down up to about 10, 15 participants and really go into what is the motivation from smoking. So the interview approach would clearly define sample and recruitment approach for qualitative data collection. Sampling elements would include students from participating public high schools from major metropolitan areas throughout the country who have qualified for further steps of the study based on quantitative study results. The sampling frame would not be utilized. The sampling method would be non-probability of purposive sampling, with pre-established criteria of answering yes to using tobacco pouches such as e-cigarettes and vape devices, and actually only using e-cigarettes and vape devices would be chosen unless they were simultaneously using them both. Recruitment will take place at pre-established high school that had already participated in the study. That way, there might be a survey or online forum that have already implemented that we could piggyback off of and probably use it to save funding. And then upon establishing the sample and recruiting participants based on the listed criteria, qualitative data would be collected and from a structured interview, and then after the interview, we can then code it into the themes that we see throughout this study. With the interview, there's a lot of advantages to this approach. This allows for clarification, and at this time, the interview is present to explain and clarify. For example, the symptoms the teen may experience after vaping, which will vary from person to person, and that will allow the public health professional or physician or healthcare professional to eliminate any signs and symptoms that may not be directly related to vaping unless they were structured in themes after reviewing the qualitative information. With this way, we also have a high response rate. Again, that is more from the quantitative and the high response rate. So we already kind of create our own pool with that sampling method. And then this also allows us to gather in-depth information. And this is kind of the tricky part. So it's how to stay on topic with teenagers. And that's something I thought of in the past as well. But it's able to obtain a greater detail and pursue hunches, and open-ended questions provide greater detail into the participants' vaping habits, and I think learning the habits is the greatest part of the qualitative information. And then lastly, another advantage would be non-judgmental probative questions. Asking questions in a non-judgmental fashion create room for an honest discussion with teenagers. To that effect, it is important to avoid why questions, but rather change those questions to what and how questions, as teenagers typically view why questions as accusatory, blame attributing, interrogatory, and may become defensive according to psychologists. Christina Rigoli. And a continuation of the interview process, it's really important to tailor the line of discussion to the individual. With our research questions, we are targeting teenagers who are vaping, and since this is a little more maybe sensitive population or sample that we're dealing with, because they are teenagers, and as we were all teenagers once, I think I can say I was definitely most likely emotional. So we need informed consent to the individual or parental consent of the minor. Having informed consent of the parent will increase participation by parental-child responsibility. The next is, maybe probably the most important, is to build rapport. When interviewing or surveying participants, it is important to foster a sense of trust and community. In doing so, the research participants selected generalizable to the sample of the population. And then as a research, as we are doing now, since our research is being set in the high school setting, the setting would be familiar. So meeting the participant in a familiar setting enables relaxation and comfort without wasting time to familiarize the participant with new surroundings. I think it's really important to either use the high school or maybe a Starbucks or a coffee shop nearby to do these interviews, because not everyone is always comfortable in their high school as well. I know I wasn't. And then I would start with basic questions first, make it easy, and then trail it down to maybe the harder ones. Another really important is to focus, stay on topic, because Sometimes if there's too good of a connection there, that a lot of the times research or the interview can go away. And then also, along with that, stay relevant to the topic. And then with the conclusion, finish the interview and reflect on what you've gained, meaning to go through the information collection, confirm that is correct. This will help reduce a little bit of confirmation bias as well. For future studies, and like we said, since we're doing a longitudinal observational study, a really good thing to think about when going forward, especially considering a cross-sectional study, is to think of and consider who is unreachable in our research question. We must think further than the teenage high school environment. Vaping is a widespread issue whose scope is far beyond high school students. Considered factors that could lead to a lack of data when it comes to sampling teenagers. To obtain high school information populations would indicate lower socioeconomic families, those who obtain a GED, or who dropped out of secondary education missed together. Multiple information gathering strategies include archival, information from past researchers to close gaps in any missing data that represents all communities within our studied sample. Key interviews. This could be a researcher interview for purposes to reach the unreachable. It would be best to employ a community member or community health worker to reach underrepresented groups within our research to close data gaps. This could be in forms of one-on-one interviews or focus groups. New technology. With advent of telemedicine, it spans across new territory with how researchers and medical providers reach their participant and patients. Internet is available for free in libraries, universities, and clinics to answer questions. With the proper incentives such as monetary, it would be easy to groom participants to access telemedicine to answer surveys with a researcher in this medium. And lastly, storage. Surveys and interviews should be digitized and held electronically, used multiple secretary measures for prior analysis. On this slide, these are more strategies in continuation to reach participants or increase efficacy of responses from participants. Going to the participant would support greater participation rather in school, depending on the respondent to attend interview at researcher's location, provides great diversity across various environments and backgrounds. High schools in different neighborhoods, suburban, inner city, and rural areas all have different environmental upbringing, so we have to really look at the circle of social determinants in order to see what best is fit, either to go to the high school or set up a separate meeting spot. Teen gathering places, parks, recreation areas, gym, as we were saying. Try a more personalized approach. I know a lot of people, especially me, people have trust issues, and so a more personalized approach would be the best. The advantage is creating rapport and understanding of the individual, working in a concert with school faculty, religious, and youth leaders provide participants with familiarity. The disadvantage, there is no anonymity, which may deter some respondents, and without that trust and anonymity, it's hard to kind of just say anything you'd like. And the best way to ask a question is to answer open-endedly, so there is more freedom to respond with gusto. Asking open-ended questions encourages detailed responses. Participants define what's important, allows interview to probe further to obtain greater in-depth information, and interview may observe body language, nonverbal cues, and inferences. These would be the examples of questions that we ask during these parts of the interview when it comes to more of the qualitative questions. And if you read through, it kind of gives allow more open-endedness to respond. Our last slide includes our IRB board application. We just want to mention that it was submitted to the application through Benedict University with Dr. Damian Bias as a student advisor, along with the confidentiality and privacy in all aspects of the team research has been addressed. And that since our population is under the age of 18 primarily, that we did do an informed consent waiver as well. Thank you for your time, and the last slide will be our concluding note. In conclusion to this assignment, what I've learned, and I think what my team has learned in this assignment, is how to well structure an interview and well structure kind of a research question, how to kind of build on top of the research question to get the most information data we can to give our best advice on recommendation for an intervention. Though there are many ways to tackle vaping, we feel that starting with the youth and educating the younger generations is an important step to eliminate the use of any type of stimulant products in the future. So not that we're just targeting vaping, but the younger we go, the more in-depth we go, we'll be able to find solutions to intervene where vaping is occurring. Because as we see, trends go younger and younger and younger to using drugs. And so the younger we go, we're kind of catching the next generation before it starts with these epidemics of using these products. Thank you for listening to our presentation, and I hope you enjoyed it, and I've enjoyed being in this class. Thank you.